to UCL, to the Rethinking Eastern Europe and Eurasia seminar series. We're really delighted to be partnering today with the Ukrainian Institute London. And we're really thrilled to have a very exciting guest with us to speak about his new book. Professor Eugene Finkel is Kenneth H. Keller Professor of International Affairs at Johns Hopkins University. And his most recent book is Intent to Destroy, Russia's 200-Year Quest to Dominate Ukraine, published last year by Basic Books. We will have some copies of the book for sale. They're on their way, they're somewhere in London traffic at the moment, but they will be for sale just outside. When you go out that door, on the left-hand side, there'll be somebody selling books. Card only. He's also the author of Ordinary Jews, Choice and Survival During the Holocaust, Princeton University Press 2017, and co-author of Reform and Rebellion in Weak States, Cambridge University Press 2020, Bread and Autocracy, Food, Politics and Security in Putin's Russia. And he has had articles published in the American Political Science Review, Journal of Politics, Comparative Political Studies, Comparative Politics, and many others. He has also published articles and op-eds in the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Foreign Affairs, The Spectator, and others. The event will proceed as follows. We will have a short lecture by Professor Finkel for around 30-40 minutes. Then Professor Finkel will be in conversation with our second guest for the evening, Olesya Khromeychuk. Dr. Olesya Khromeychuk is a historian and writer. Many of us in the room will know her from her role as the director of the Ukrainian Institute in London. She's also the author of the book The Death of a Soldier, told by his sister, published in 2022. And she has written for the New York Times, New York Review of Books, The Guardian, Der Spiegel, Prospect, New Statesman, and many more. And she's delivered a TED Talk on what the world can learn from Ukraine's fight for democracy. So if you haven't watched it already, please Google that. And she's also taught history of East Central Europe at several UK universities, including this one. So Olesya will come on stage in a little while. But first of all, Professor Finkel will tell us about his book. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. So, thanks, William. Thanks, Olesya, for organizing it. And of course, thank you all for coming. I know that there are many things happening in London and in the world right now, and many of them are horrible, but, we do what we can. So, I'm here, we'll be talking about my book that came out several months ago in late November with Basic Books in the US and the UK. So here are the two covers. You decide which one is more macabre than the other, but that's essentially what the book is about. The working title of the book, as I was writing it, was even more explicit. It was To Kill Ukraine. Eventually, the editor decided that it sounded too much like a do-it-yourself manual, so we settled on this one. But that's essentially what I wanted to explain in this book. The Russian violence in and against Ukraine, both the country and the people. Because if you look, or if you follow the news from Ukraine, you are used to the fact that violence against civilians, large-scale violence, Bucha, Mariupol, mass executions, rape, and even more horrible things like beheadings, impaling heads on sticks, castrating live POWs with box cutters, etc., 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 is a central feature of this war. And we somehow, started taking it for granted. It is what it is. But for me, especially at the very beginning of the war, it was a puzzle. Because on the one hand, we saw this kind of violence, but on the other, if you were to listen to Russian propaganda and Russian media, they would present the war as a war of liberation, as a war to protect oppressed Ukrainian Russian speakers or Ukrainians more broadly who are being oppressed, repressed, and mistreated by the neo-Nazi regime in Kiev. And for me, those two things simply did not work together. Now, I'm not an historian, I'm a social scientist by training, but I still know enough about wars to tell you that genuine wars of liberation do not involve castrating the very people you are trying to liberate and mass executions and beheading POWs. So that's essentially what I try to understand in this book, the violence against civilians. But as I started writing and reading, I realized that obviously I cannot understand what is happening on the ground just by starting with February 22. And obviously not even with 2014. I had to go back in time. And the more I went back in time, the more it became a historical narrative that covered the last 200 years or so. So the focus of the book shifted. From trying to explain the current war, it became a more or less history narrative that covers the history of Russian-Ukrainian relations since mid-19th century. Of course, I do talk about the war in this book. There are several chapters on that, but the focus is different. So essentially what I try to understand is why and how over the last 200 years or so, Russian imperial, Soviet, and post-Soviet governments did all they could to control and dominate Ukraine, both the country, the area, and the people, and not just ethnic Ukrainians, but also the minorities. The minorities turned out to play a very important role in this story, even more important than most people realize, and also the violence that those Russian and Soviet authorities use when they cannot dominate Ukraine peacefully. In other words, what I try to understand is how from dominating Ukraine, the Russian and Soviet policies regularly shifted to an effort to kill Ukraine as an idea, as a language, as an identity, and sometimes as people. But before I present you my argument, since we are in a university setting and I'm a professor, let's do a short quiz. So what I will show you are 3 quotes. You tell me how many of them belong to Putin, and if yes, which one? Come on, 1, 2, 3. Just raise your hands with numbers. 1, 2, 3. 3. 1, 3, 2, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. Okay, you get it. Actually, just one. I think William, you got it right. The first one is Putin, is from his infamous July 2021 article on the historical unity of the Russian and Ukrainian people. But you wouldn't know that unless you actually read this article very carefully, and I don't suggest anyone reading it. What are the other two? Well, the other two, the second one is Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, the commander-in-chief of the Russian army during World War I, just before Russian army invaded Austro-Hungary, or more specifically, Galicia and Bukovina, which are now Western Ukraine. And the third one is Vyacheslav Molotov, Stalin's Minister of Foreign Affairs, of the Molotov-Ribbentrop fame, just before justifying the Soviet invasion of Poland on September 17th, 1939, when Stalin and Hitler decided to carve up Europe. So then, what we have are 3 quotes from 3 different Russian and Soviet officials who are pretty much identical, and then the question is why? What drives those continuities? Why and where do they come from? And more importantly for me, how exactly those quotes, those ideas, those intentions translate into action. And that's what I'm trying to understand in this book. So, let me present you what I found in a nutshell. So, essentially, my argument is that over the last 200 years, with some very brief interruptions in 1920s and 1990s, controlling and dominating Ukraine was the key goal of imperial Russian, Soviet, and post-Soviet Russian governments. And this desire to control Ukraine, and we can reasonably describe this desire as an obsession with Ukraine, is driven by a combination of 2 factors: identity and security. It's not just an identity war, but it's definitely not and predominantly not a security-driven war, as many of my colleagues in international relations try to argue. Now, if you know anything about Russia and Ukraine, you probably know the key components of the identity story, but since not everyone here is familiar with the history, let me just state them briefly and expand on them. So where this identity-driven obsession with Ukraine comes from? Well, it's a three-pronged explanation. The first is that both Russia and Ukraine trace their history to Kievan Rus, which is a medieval East Slavic state that encompassed most of modern Ukraine, Western Russia, and Belarus. And in the 30th century, this state was destroyed by a Mongol invasion. The territory of what is now Ukraine was quickly absorbed by Poland and Lithuania, but the more eastern part came under Mongol rule, and out of the Mongol rule, Moscow emerged as a powerful state with imperial ambition and what is perceived to be a God-given natural right to dominate all Kievan Rus lands, and a belief that Moscow is a natural continuation, a natural heir of Kiev, which is not just a foundation story. Quite a few states have those foundation stories. It's also a geopolitical problem if you consider Kiev not just be a mythical past capital, but a capital of a different country, Ukraine. The second related component is the belief that the Russian nation consists of three branches: the Great Russians, or simply Russians, Little Russians, those are Ukrainians, and White Russians, which are Belarusians. They're different, but they're still one people. And the term Great and Little Russians also implies a hierarchical relationship, with Great Russians being on top, the older brother, the one in charge, and the Little Russians are just underneath them, but still underneath. Now, it wasn't intended this way. Originally, the term Great and Little Russia were simply geographical terms. But once you start using the term Great and Little, they have to evolve into a hierarchical relationship, and that's exactly what happened. And a third component is an idea that those three branches have just one proper language of culture, literature, science, poetry, administration, and this language is, of course, Russian. Ukrainian, and for that matter also Belarusian, are just regional dialects spoken by uneducated peasants. They are not fit for high culture, literature, science, and do not deserve to be used for those purposes. In fact, this peasant dialect, again, from the Russian perspective, need to be actively suppressed, either to prevent a waste of resources or to not to encourage harmful separatism. Now, again, most people who know anything about Russia and Ukraine know this. What most people do not, and those beliefs also became deeply, deeply ingrained within the Russian perception of itself and of Ukraine. They're taken for granted by the vast majority of Russians, and from Russia they also move westward, where many people in the West still perceive Ukraine as essentially Russia and Ukrainians as essentially Russians. What most people do not realize is how recent those ideas are. They are not God-given, and they are not even ancient. They're essentially a product of early mid-19th century, and they're a direct outcome of the fight between the Russian Empire and the Polish national movement. Because before the partitions of Poland in 18th century, most of Ukraine was part of Poland, and that meant that most of the nobility in Ukraine and most of the urban population were Catholic Poles. When Russia, Prussia, and Austria partitioned Poland out of existence, they received not just Ukraine, but also and most of Poland, but also the Polish national movement within those territories that fought really hard in several bloody uprisings in 1830, 1831, and then in 1860s to regain their independence, and with the independence also regain the territories that they considered theirs, mostly West Bank Ukraine, right Bank Ukraine and Belarus. So the key fear for the Russian government was that those local Polish elites might corrupt the peasants, the Ukrainian peasants, and might convince them that they're actually not Russians or little Russians, but they're Poles. And therefore, starting in the 1830s, the Russian imperial government came up with a very elaborate program to emphasize the Russianness of the region and of the Orthodox living there, precisely to prevent them from being corrupted by the Poles and being turned against the government. And over time, this program of emphasizing the Russianness of the region also turned into a pretty violent, pretty repressive campaign of forced Russification. Instead of trying to convince people that they are little Russians, the focus switched to forcing those people to perceive themselves as Russians without adjectives. And this campaign to protect the Russian Empire from the harmful Polish influence naturally leads me to the second factor, which is security. Now, here we're talking about two types of security. The first is national security, and Ukraine is occasionally called the gates of Europe. That's also the title of the wonderful history of Ukraine by the Harvard historian Serhiy Plokhy. But gates occasionally open both ways. And that's also what happens in Ukraine. So if you look at Russian history, quite a few invasions of Russia historically passed through Ukraine. There are natural obstacles, natural borders between Ukraine and the rest of Europe. There are Carpathian Mountains, there are the Pripyat marshes. There are none between Russia and Ukraine, so controlling Ukraine from the Russian perspective was extremely important for national security. But even more important than national security was the regime security, especially if the Russian or the Soviet regime is an autocracy, which Russia and Soviet Union were for the vast majority of their existence. Because few things scare a Russian autocrat more than a free democratic Ukraine, because if Ukrainians manage to build a democracy, and they're the same people as Russians, then Russians might, God forbid, demand the same things as well. Now, it's a catch-22 situation. The fear is self-imposed. It can be fixed quite easily by admitting or realizing that Ukrainians and Russians are actually not the same people. So you don't need to fear a democratic Ukraine because for some reason it might want to teach Russians to do the same, but that would undermine the identity basis of the regime. So it's a catch-22 situation. It's a corner into which the Russian authorities eventually put themselves. And at different point in time, the importance of each of those factors would change, but they almost always will be present. And for the vast majority for most of the story that I'm telling, the identity concerns were much more important than the security ones. And my final point is that violence and repression are costly. So, from the Russian perspective, there is a desire to control and dominate Ukraine, but if it can be done peacefully and on the cheap, then they, of course, would prefer to do it peacefully and on the cheap rather than investing effort, money, and people into conquering Ukraine. And what it meant in practice is a very smart, very elaborate strategy to use the internal diversity of Ukraine in what I call the divide and repress strategy. Because Ukraine, if you know anything about Ukraine, was and still is an extremely diverse place. You know, in the book, when I started listing all the ethnic and religious groups that call Ukraine home, it took about 3 to 4 lines of text. And the Russian authorities obviously know that as well. So the strategy was to repress some groups in Ukraine that at that particular point in time, the Russian or the Soviet authorities considered the most threatening, while at the same time protecting and elevating others who would do the Russian bidding in Ukraine, will serve as the local agents of the government, will be pretty happy with Russian and Soviet control, will provide the manpower, will provide the local knowledge. And over time, those groups that are protected and elevated would change. Sometimes those would be the traditional Ukrainian elites. Sometimes that would be a proletariat or an urban Russian-speaking middle classes, or ethnic minorities like Jews in certain points in time. But the point is that at any given moment throughout most of the story, there were groups in Ukraine that were prioritized over others and were pretty happy with Moscow's or St. Petersburg control. And therefore, by the way, we also cannot treat the history of Ukraine and Russia as just the story of Russians and Ukrainians. That's where the ethnic minorities come in and play an extremely important role in this story. And those factors, identity and security, were also present in 2022. But at least in my view, what explains the invasion is that, and the violence against civilians, that in 2022, for pretty much the first time in history, this divide and repress strategy failed. Because since the Euromaidan in 2014 and the Russian annexation of Crimea and the war in the Donbass, we see again for the first time in history the emergence of a truly political civic Ukrainian nation that covers most of the population, where which region you are from or which language do you speak or your ethnicity and religion is less important than your allegiance to Ukraine as a political nation. In part, it's a response to the Russian 2014 annexation of Crimea and aggression. I have spoken to many Russian-speaking Ukrainians who were very pro-Russian before 2014, but were just so offended by the lies and the annexation and whatever Russia did that they switched their allegiance. Some, in part, it's also a natural reaction to growing up in independent Ukraine and getting used to the state and not wanting any other. Because if you look at the generations who are leading the fight against Russia right now, they were either born in independent Ukraine or were young children or teenagers when Soviet Union collapsed, and they have absolutely no nostalgia for the Soviet Union. After all, Zelensky, we were born in the same year. He was 14 when the Soviet Union collapsed. Ukraine is the only country that the people of our generation know. So, now, a caveat. I do not want to present Ukrainian community as somehow monolithic, or to say that since 2014, cleavage has disappeared, or everyone in Ukraine has become a liberal Democrat, or there are no people in Ukraine who quietly or not so quietly support Russia and are Putinists. Of course they exist. The point is that they are a minority. The point is that Russia would not have invaded if they could dominate and control Ukraine peacefully. It's just that the problem for Russia is that in 2022, this proposition was not attractive enough for the vast majority of Ukrainians. So, to achieve their constant goal of controlling Ukraine, Russia had to use force. And I think the failure of this divide and repress strategy also explains to a large degree a violence against civilians in Ukraine. I'm talking less about violence of the Mariupol style with indiscriminate shelling and destruction of cities, but more Bucha-style violence and the violence that we see behind Russian lines, which is quite targeted. And it's still a suspicion, a hypothesis. We still don't have enough data, but I'm pretty certain that what explains this violence is that Russians genuinely believed that they would be treated as liberators. And when that did not happen, the perception of Ukrainians switched from that of brothers to that of not just enemies, worse than enemies, traitors. And the violence was a violence of revenge for this rejection, essentially a violence of punishment, a violence of how dare you not to be the Russians that we believe you ought to be. Now, how those things that I described work in practice. So, In the book, I talk about several key episodes: the 19th and 20th century Russian Empire, the Civil War, the repressions, the famine, World War II, post-war Soviet Union, and of course the current war. Today I want to talk briefly about one period which is extremely important, extremely interesting, but is barely known, even among the Ukrainians themselves. And that's the Russian occupation of Galicia and Bukovina during World War I in 1914, 1915. So what the story is here, and I will have to move out of the frame. So essentially we're talking about this region, which is now Western Ukraine. So what happens there? Unlike in the Russian Empire, where the Ukrainian language was repressed, in Austro-Hungary, Ukrainians enjoyed political rights and equality, and therefore there was an extremely active political Ukrainian scene, cultural political scene. There were Ukrainian schools, there were Ukrainian language classes and Ukrainian chairs in University of Lviv. In 1914, there was even a plan to create a Ukrainian language university that collapsed because World War I started. And that, of course, was extremely attractive, not just for Ukrainians in Galicia and Bukovina, but also for the Ukrainian activists in the Russian Empire itself. Many of them did move to Galicia. Mikhailo Khrushchevsky, essentially the founder of the Ukrainian national movement and the first president of Ukraine, he was a Russian subject, but he was also a professor of Ukrainian history at the University of Lviv, where he moved because he could not do his work in the Russian Empire. And from the Russian perspective, the existence of this Ukrainian island was a mortal threat. Why? Because in the first half of the 20th, because at the beginning of the 20th century, the politics in the Russian Empire shifted to that of parties, parliaments, mass participation, and Russians had their censuses and knew the math. And the numbers were very simple. If Ukrainians are little Russians, then together, the Great Russians and the Little Russians are about 65% of the population of the empire. If the Little Russians are no longer Russians, but something else, that is Ukrainian, the share of Russians in their own empire goes down to about 45%, and essentially Russians become a minority in their own empire. And again, from the perspective of the Russian imperial government, it was a mortal danger. So what the Russian government did? Well, first they started finding and cultivating local pro-Russian activists in Galicia. And even back then, you could read some Ukrainian activists and their allies writing about this danger. They would come in, they would fund those people, they would build Russian schools, and then they will claim that they need to protect those people, and they will invade. Which, of course, if you know the history of 2014 and 2022, was exactly the justification of the Russian invasion. And the second prong was to beef up the anti-Ukrainian propaganda in the Russian Empire. For instance, there was a very popular argument that the Ukrainian identity itself is an invasion of Western enemies of Russia. In this case, the Austrian military intelligence. So there are literally people in the general staff of the Austro-Hungarian army sitting there and creating the Ukrainians out of thin air, or that those people, including Mikhailo Khrushchevsky, are somehow secretly funded by the Jews, because you can't get without the Jews in this story. And again, if you look at the Russian propaganda again in 2022, it's not Austrians anymore, it's the Americans or the Brits, but the gist of the idea is the same. Ukrainian identity is invented, and it's invented explicitly to harm Russia. And so then, what happens in the war itself? When the war begins, the Russian rhetoric is explicitly to liberate the Ukrainian Russians. They don't use any other language. That's how they're treated. Whether those people in Galicia want to be treated in Russia is beside the point. The Russians decided that they're Russians and nothing else matters. So I already showed you the quote from Grand Duke Nicholas. The Tsar Nikolai II himself talked about, there was no Galicia, rather one great Great Russia to the Carpathians, and that we need to annex Galicia and Bukovina so that Russia would finally reach its natural borders. The war starts very badly for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and by September 1914, Russians control most of eastern Galicia and Bukovina. The goal is very explicitly to annex those territories. They want to do it immediately during the war. Eventually, they decide that they will have to wait a bit after the war, but they will still start treating those territories as if it's not an occupied territory, but Russia proper. What does it mean treating those territories in Russia? Well, first of all, it means massive plunder. Everything that could be stolen is stolen. I haven't read any histories of kitchen sinks and bathtubs being stolen, but that's simply because they did not exist. But other than that, pretty much everything that could be stolen was stolen, including my favorite story of a Cossack unit destroying the specimen collection in the zoology department of the university in Chernovtsi, where they broke the jars in which the specimens were preserved and drank the alcohol. There was also quite a lot of indiscriminate violence against civilians, but within this violence, there is very targeted violence against Ukrainian elites. The politicians, the activists, the religious leaders, the writers, the journalists, they are pretty much all arrested and either exiled or taken as hostages. And again, we see quite a lot of parallel with that with what is going on in the occupied territories in eastern Ukraine. Beyond that, the Russian authorities start promoting local collaborators, even though they were very marginal people in the community. Obviously, they have to be Ukrainians who treat themselves or view themselves as Russians, and they start sending people from Russia proper to administer those territories, because you can't treat those territories as if they're Russia unless there are Russian bureaucrats running them. They also changed the language of administration into Russian, even though almost no one in Galicia and Bukovina speaks Russian. They changed the street signs. They even changed the alphabet from Latin to Cyrillic, even though very few people at that time can read Cyrillic. They start changing names of streets and places. They remove statutes. They even switch the area to the St. Petersburg time zone. Of course, all publications in Ukrainian are banned. Nothing can be published, produced, not even calendars and fairy tales. You can't even write letters and telegrams in Ukrainian because the postal censors are instructed to destroy all this correspondence, even though you had no problem writing letters and sending telegrams in German, the language of the enemy, or French, or even Czech, or Polish, or Romanian. Only two languages abound, Ukrainian and Yiddish. And, of course, they target the region's educational system. First, they shut down all schools, but then they allow Polish and German schools to reopen. Ukrainian schools are closed above the elementary school level. The teachers are forced to take Russian language crash courses and teaching in Russian, even though neither the teachers nor the students understand Russian. They start very quickly sending teachers from the rest of the empire. And the goal is very explicit: annexation, Russification, destruction of anything that smacks of Ukrainian identity and activism through all available means. And when I was writing this, and this occupation was relatively short. It lasted for about a year plus, and it got overshadowed by everything else that was happening during World War I. So very few people in Ukraine actually know this story. For me, it was a revelation because I am from the region. My great-grandparents lived through the Russian occupation. I knew nothing about that. I don't know if some of you come from Galicia and Bukovina, what your families know about what happened there. But it was also a schizophrenic experience because I was writing this chapter in summer 2023, and in the morning I would read the news about what's happening in eastern Ukraine and what Russians are doing in those areas, and then go back to the historical documents, and it would be literally to the T with two exceptions, the date and the place. Other than that, it would be almost identical with two exceptions. In Galicia, there was a campaign of forced conversion into the Orthodox Church because most Ukrainians there are Greek Catholics. It's not the case in the occupied territories, although some churches that do not belong to the Moscow Patriarchate are still being targeted, and there were no massive pogroms in eastern Ukraine in 2022 simply because there are no Jews. But other than that, it's almost identical. Now, importantly, this Russian occupation of Galicia was different from Russian occupation of other territories during World War I. Eastern Prussia, Caucasus, there the occupation was violent, brutal, but there was no attempt to remake the identity of the region. There was no attempt to annex. It was reserved only for Ukrainian regions. However, I'm not saying that Russian authorities in 2022 are consciously taking out of retirement old policies. In fact, I'm not sure if there is anyone in the Kremlin who actually knows what the Russians did in 1914 Galicia. Well, maybe if any of them read this book, they will. But other than that, what it does boil down to is that policies are so similar simply because the goals and the ideas driving them and the general perceptions are so persistent over time that they get repeated. Now, at the same time, and I know we don't have much time, so I will be fast, I'm not saying that, that the story is deterministic, that somehow Russians are bound to be obsessed with Ukraine and try to dominate it. Obsession with Ukraine is a choice. It's not a God-given destiny. And there were periods of time where Russians thought differently or tried to do things differently. They failed, but for me as a social scientist, it's very important to understand those periods, to understand what exactly they did right, very little, and what exactly they did wrong, even though they did try to break this mold. So that next time when it will be tried, it will work better. And I'm an optimist by nature. I hope we will get there. So the most important period for me is 1990s, Yeltsin's Russia. Why? Because after the Soviet collapse, there was a chance to get things right and to do things differently. Soviet Union collapses, Russia and Ukraine go their different ways. And importantly, Yeltsin himself, he did many horrible things, but when it came to Ukraine, he instinctively understood that for Russia to be a normal state, Ukraine has to be independent, because otherwise, with Ukraine, Russia will be forced to repeat the story of the Soviet Union and the empire. He was in a minority. Most Russians did not perceive Ukraine as a separate state, but they were also too busy trying to survive in the middle of an economic crisis. We have more than enough public opinion evidence about what they thought about Ukraine. And most of them did think that Ukraine is not a real state, and at least parts of Ukraine should go back to Russia, but it wasn't high on the agenda. They were busy doing other things. So it was a rare moment of opportunity to do something, to change the story. And importantly, the government beyond Yeltsin were the liberals, the Democrats, who also did not want to invade Ukraine. They wanted a peaceful, democratic Russia. So that was an opportunity for them to do something about it, to create a different story, to build a different relationship. What the Russian liberals did about this story and about those perceptions? The answer is nothing. And it's easy to criticize those people, and they deserve a lot of criticism. It wasn't because of malice. Their heart was in the right place when it came to Ukraine, but they were not thinking in those terms. Most of them were economists, and most of them were thinking about economy rather than history. or identity. They believed that the way to build a democratic, peaceful Russia is through economic reforms. That's what they focused on. They believed that if reforms succeed, then all the other good things will follow, and they focused on that. When it came to history, identity, or a different vision for what Russia is, they did absolutely nothing. And most of them were not even thinking in those terms. And that was a huge mistake. It was a huge mistake because when reforms failed and failed to deliver the prosperity they wanted, there was absolutely no reason for the majority of Russians to support this democratic, peaceful Russia despite the pain. Instead, the story of Russia that became dominant was the story of the opposition. The so-called red-brown alliance, red for the communism and brown for the fascists. It was a very divided, I mean, you're laughing, that's how they are called in history books, the red-brown alliance, or the red-brown coalition, красно-коричневый. And those people argued about pretty much everything and were divided on pretty much everything besides two things that united them. First, they hated democracy. And second, all of them believed that Ukraine should be part of Russia. If not fully, then in part. And here there are three groups that I will go over very quickly. The first group are the communists. They wanted to recreate the Soviet Union, and obviously you can't have a Soviet Union without Ukraine. The Soviet Union collapsed because Ukraine voted on independence in their referendum on December 1st, 1991. So for them, that's the first step. They also control the parliament. And they issue many proclamations and decisions, invalidating the transfer of Crimea to Ukraine or the Belovezh Accords. Back then, it was considered a bit of a noise, but they meant it, and it created the narrative. An even more powerful group, at least intellectually, were the conservatives. Here, the two main figures are Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Nobel Prize-winning writer and the dissident, and Yuri Lushkov, the mayor of Moscow. Solzhenitsyn, he is venerated in the West, but he was also a pretty rabid Russian nationalist. For him, what should come out of the wreckage of the Soviet Union is a new state that would include Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and possibly northern Kazakhstan, because that's where Russians live. He did not believe that Ukraine is a real state or Ukrainians are separate people. He had nothing against Ukrainians as such. In fact, he considered himself, I quote, almost a half Ukrainian. How you can be almost a half Ukrainian, I have no idea. But that's how he thought about himself. His idea was that, you know what? Those people should be with us. But if they're crazy enough to want independence, let them do it, but only in their true borders. The true borders started at Dnipro. So eastern and southern Ukraine is a Russian land, and they should, and of course Crimea as well, they should be part of Russia. Interestingly, he was one of the very few people who, starting in very late 1980s, 89, early 1990s, was seriously talking about the possibility of a war between Russia and Ukraine. Nobody took him seriously back then, but to his credit, he did envision this possibility. His idea was, it might happen. If it happened, I will never let my sons to fight in this war, no matter what. But when it comes to eastern Ukraine, for him it should be Russia. Lushkov, the very powerful mayor of Moscow, he managed to get himself PNG to declare persona non grata in Ukraine for going to Crimea and publicly stating that Crimea should be Russia. He also tried to start coordinating with Crimean authorities to build a bridge that would connect the mainland Russia with Ukraine without consulting the Ukrainian government first. So they shut it down very fast. But after 2014, this bridge was one of the first things that Russia did. And the radicals, Limonov, Dugin, Limonov, the writer and the head of the National Bolshevik Party, and Dugin, the geopolitical guru, who some people consider Putin's brain. He is not. Those people envision Russia as a continental empire, and of course, continental empire has to include Ukraine. We tended to consider those people crazy and laugh them out of the room for many years, But Limonov and his National Bolsheviks were absolutely instrumental in starting the war in the Donbass. If you look at the names of Russians who went to fight in the Donbass, with the exception of leaders like Girkin Strelkov, it would be a roster of National Bolsheviks, by and large. Dugin, he's not Putin's brain, but pretty much most of the things that he was saying 20 years ago and was laughed and ridiculed at, now it's being repeated almost verbatim by Putin. He was also the person who produced the map of divided Ukraine, with the east being Novorossiya, many years before it happened. So that was the narrative. And when the liberals failed, that was the only vision of history that was available to the Russian people. And it became so mainstream, so ingrained, to moments, and I'm done. Then even the Russian liberals started abandoning this language of liberalism. Some started to modify it. So for instance, one of the leaders of the Russian liberals, a guy who was essentially the architect of the economic reform, Boris Chubais, started talking about Russia as a liberal empire. You are Brits, maybe you know what a liberal empire is, I have no idea. And some abandoned it altogether. So what I want to finish with is this book, this cover. That's a book, it has been translated into English and for a good reason, titled The Third Empire, Russia as It Should Be. It was published in 2007. The author is a quite prominent politician at that time, vice speaker of the Russian parliament, interestingly from a very liberal Yabloko party, and this book was a hit. We know that it was read extremely widely in the Kremlin and the security services. It's a bad, tedious, boring book, but so let me summarize it for you. So what happens in this book? Well, it's a futuristic novel about mid-21st century, about 25 years from now. The world is divided into 5 states that run the world. Here in the red is, of course, the Russian Empire. It's, of course, explicitly an empire governed by the Tsar. It also includes most of Europe and the UK, so congratulations, you have finally rejoined. How Russia becomes this empire? Well, it's easy. Russia defeats the US in a nuclear war with a super weapon produced by Russian scientists. But what is even more important is how Russia starts expanding. Well, guess what happens? And again, we're talking about the book that was written and published 2007, 2008. It's obviously start with Ukraine, because Ukraine, and I love this quote, irritated the Kremlin elites by the very fact of its existence. And what happens in this story? It's 2007. There is a political crisis in Ukraine. Ukraine is divided. There are some protests in the east. There is a small-scale rebellion. But when the government in Kiev gets its act together and moves to quash this uprising, the rebels ask Moscow for help. The Kremlin sends in the troops, defeat the Ukrainians, keeps the US and NATO out by threatening to use nuclear weapons. And after this defeat in eastern and southern Ukraine, there is a referendum. After this referendum, the Novorossiya regions rejoin Russia, and then several years later, the rest of Ukraine follows. You would be forgiven to think that that's exactly how the story went in 2014 and 2022, because that's exactly how it happened. And you know, there are many people who believe that this book was actually read in the Kremlin not as a futuristic novel, but as a kind of to-do manual. I wouldn't go that far, despite the similarities. And the story is extremely similar, but that does show you that the ideas and the perceptions and the policies that come out of them are pretty stable over time when it comes to Russian obsession with Ukraine. So I have one more slide talking about how we can fix it, but maybe we can talk about that during the Q&A. So I will stop here. Thank you.
So when I was reading your book, which I was going to say I enjoyed, I didn't because of the subject matter, but I enjoyed it as a text. And one of the reasons why I enjoyed it so much is because you cover such an enormous scope, you cover such a huge period of time. but you do so in a very nuanced way, as a scholar would, and yet at the same time you manage to make it accessible. You make it accessible to non-scholars as well, and that's a true gift. So thank you for doing that. It's the sort of book we really need at the moment, and I really hope that everybody will buy it today or in the future and spread the word about it. Before we go back to history, let's begin with today. We've all been nervously reading the news. What's your take on what's happening and, essentially discussing Ukraine without Ukraine?
Okay, so first of all, as a US citizen working in a US institution, I apologize. I'm sorry. We screwed up. I mean, we as a country, not. So, but more seriously, I mean, look, there is no way to sugarcoat it. It's bad. It's really bad. But, freaking out is not a strategy either. So the question is what can happen and what we can do. By we, I mean people in the US who support Ukraine, or Europeans for that matter. So it does look scary, but at the same time, at least as of now, I wouldn't be freaking out too much, because what Trump says does not always translate to what Trump does. And again, Trump is inconsistency, Trump is also chaos. And in chaos, many horrible things can happen, absolutely. And I suspect some of them will happen. But in chaos, also quite unexpected things happen, and some of them might be unexpectedly nice. Not because Trump likes Ukraine or is a friend of Ukraine, but simply because that's what happens during chaos. At the same time, I'm still trying to wrap my head around how exactly he is going to do it when the plan is essentially, building on his statements from last week that US would control whatever underground. So I have no idea how they're going to, get the arrangement when Russia control what's above the ground and US what's underground, whatever it is. So there are some built-in inconsistencies there as well. So for me, what we can do is be concerned, but also do something about it. So what does it mean? Well, for us in the US, it means working with the few reasonable and sensible people that do exist in this administration, and they do exist. I mean, I'm not a fan of this administration, and it has many horrible people, but National Security Advisor Waltz is not one of them. Secretary of State Rubio is not one of them. So we still have some people to talk to and try to do what we can, even though it can be limited. It definitely also means that Europe and the UK should do much more. And we have evidence that they can do so much more. So, for instance, it was a very smart move by Macron to invite Trump and Zelensky to the opening of Notre Dame and have them sit down together. And immediately after that, you would listen to Trump and you would almost hear Zelensky speak. Now, obviously, he came back to the US and started listening to all the other people around him. So it passed fast, but it can happen. And also, people in Ukraine should start taking it more seriously. And instead of fighting internal fights with sanctioning oligarchs in the middle of this crisis, maybe also reach out to their allies and just focus on building something united against it. Because after all, there is a limit to what Trump and Putin can impose. Right? There will not be peace or ceasefire without Ukraine. They might want to talk without Ukraine, but essentially those are Ukrainians who decide what to do about it and whether to fight or not. So, yeah, it's not looking good, but let's do something rather than just freaking out, because freaking out is not a policy.
Absolutely. Definitely, Ukrainians will be the ones deciding what happens to their country, and we've seen them prove everybody wrong lots of times in history and over the last 3 years in particular. But this feeling of Ukraine being spoken about or talked about without Ukraine being present as a subject in the conversation, I sense a feeling of betrayal. And this is where I want to go back to your book. Betrayal is about lack of justice. It's about the absence of justice. And justice is not in the title of your book, but it is implied in the title of your book. The title of the book is Intent to Destroy, which is part of the definition of genocide. Tell us why we should be looking at this central question of this being a genocidal war, even if we're not lawyers.
Right. So I'm a scholar of genocide. Originally, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a social scientist. But genocide is not. No, it's not just a legal term. It's also an analytical term, and that's how I approach it. Because I think this war is genocidal, and I'm screaming that from the rooftops since April 2022. Genocide is not about numbers. Genocide is, we have the perception that, or most people have the perception that, of genocide as being, in the image of the Holocaust or the Rwandan genocide when hundreds of thousands of people were killed. No, genocide is about intent to destroy a group as such. And that's exactly what we see in Ukraine, I think. Again, I wouldn't, for instance, I would not consider Mariupol genocidal because Mariupol is just how Russians fight. They destroy everything and everyone. And we saw the similar stories in Grozny and in Aleppo. Bucha, Izium, Irpin, Kherson, where we do see a lot of indiscriminate violence, but also within this violence, very targeted violence of everyone who is somehow associated with Ukraine as a state, or Ukrainian identity, or Ukraine as an idea being explicitly targeted because of them. So that's why even though the numbers might not be as, luckily, as high as in other cases, the intent to destroy is crucial. The intent to destroy Ukraine as an independent, this how dare you reaction is absolutely central to how Russia thinks about Ukraine and what they do in Ukraine.
Absolutely. Let me read a very short extract from your book. I think this is from the International, forgive me if it isn't. You say, Putin's explicit goal is to dismantle the Western-dominated post-Cold War global order and re-establish the Kremlin's domination of much of Eurasia. Russia cannot achieve this without controlling Ukraine, the gates of Europe. And you've already mentioned this today in your talk. And then later on you say, even among Russian liberals, many viewed Ukraine as an artificial state, and some harbored neo-imperialist attitudes. I have not found it easy to persuade, especially Western European audiences, that Russia continues to act like an empire. Why is it hard, do you think, for people to grasp this? And why is the question of imperialism so crucial?
Right. So why? I mean, I wish I knew the answer. It's definitely not monocausal. There are many things. So part is, just simply because Russians happen to inhabit part of Europe and look like Westerners, then there is this perception that we as Westerners abandoned our empires and moved on, then Russians should be like us and think the same. Partly just a pretty inevitable given how large Russia is and the history. So pretty inevitable tendency of thinking about everything in this space through Russian lens. It doesn't need to be Russophile as such. For instance, I teach in a policy school. Many of my students view and are trained to view Russia as an explicit threat. But it's still because of the elections, because of nuclear weapons, whatever it is. They are not Russophiles by a mile. But they still so center on Russia that they implicitly view everything through Russian lens. That's how we used to train people. That's where the archives were. That's where, those are the languages that you used to speak. And the most maddening for me for many years, sending students to Kiev to learn Russian when Russia became less accessible. So part is just the domination of Russia in our collective psyche. Part is the question of access. Historically, Russia was very good from preventing Westerners of physically getting into Ukraine, being diplomats, journalists, scholars, whatever it is. So, and it's just a question of habit for many people. So that's I think explains a bit how the thinking goes. I do think it changes a bit, and you have written quite a lot on that. And the more people speak, the more I do see more interest in Ukraine, not just because of the war, but obviously the war did play an important role. Why they do it? Well, again, that goes to what I was talking about, how Russians perceive themselves and what they are, and those ideas do become ingrained. Unfortunately for Russians, their visions of what Russia is and the ideas about what Russia should be typically do not correspond with the resources they have. And it also goes to the question of whether this war is Putin's war or Russia's war. And my view is that without Putin, we probably would not have had this war, but without the rest of Russia, we would. So without Putin, there would not be an invasion, and without the rest of Russia, there would be no war.
I think that's a great way to put it and explain it. This war is deeply personal to all of us, or all Ukrainians, and it's impossible to be an impartial, objective scholar, I think, if you're a Ukrainian dealing with this war, nor is it, I would say, advisable, right? I mean, we've talked about the responsibility of scholarship not so long ago, and another reason why I like your book so much is that you very explicitly say that I'm quoting you, therefore neither claim nor wish to be a dispassionate and detached observer. You bravely declare your deep investment in this story, in the telling of this story. Maybe you could say a few words about that, but also maybe you could tell those of us who haven't read your book or your other writing about a man called Victor Müller Ferreira or Sergei Cherkassin.
Yes.
Yeah, Ukrainianized him by accident.
Yeah,
It's a habit.
well, yeah. Let's insult him this way. Yeah. Okay. So that's actually that's the key question. So why I wrote this book? I never intended writing this book, even during the first stages of the war. By 2022, I thought I was done with the region. I was, looking to write something else. I thought that I already said what I had to say. Then the war started, but even more importantly, I got very angry with the Russian state, not just because of the war, of course, but because of something that happened later and how, it became deeply personal. So I teach in a policy school in Washington, D.C., and in 2018 to 2020, I had a student in several of my classes, a Brazilian with German roots who came from Ireland. He studied at Trinity College Dublin, spoke English with a heavy Irish accent, so he took several of my classes. He was a good student. After he graduated, he asked me for a recommendation letter for a job at the International Criminal Court. I wrote him a glowing recommendation because he was a good student. Haven't heard from him for several years, and then it's June 2022. I'm teaching summer semester. It's the last day of classes. I give my students a break, go into my office, and there is an email from one of my colleagues. A story is going to run on in the BBC later today that we at SSEES had a student who was a Brazilian and went into ICC and was discovered as a Russian spy, and a GRU, Russian military intelligence officer, working undercover and illegal. I see the name and the world around me goes dark. I have absolutely no recollection how I finished teaching this class, but apparently I did because students did not complain. It took me several days to get over it because I'm in a policy school in Washington, D.C. Spies are part of the job, obviously. We all know that happens, but had it been a Chinese spy and industrial espionage, I would just shrug it. But June 2022, a Russian intelligence officer getting a job at the ICC that just started investigating Russian violence in Ukraine, and getting it because of me. So I decided that I need to do something about it. And being an academic nerd that I am, I decided to write the book and donate the money to Ukraine. So that's how this book happened.
Fantastic, and thank you for doing that. This is the point when I open the floor to the rest of you.
Pre-1914? 2014, right, okay.
Brilliant. Shall we
Right,
begin with
yeah,
those?
right. So why 200 years? Well,
Yes.
I can do it, yeah, right. Yeah, so why 200 years? Well, you're absolutely right. Large parts of Ukraine are controlled by Muscovy and then the Russian Empire since mid-17th century and the Treaty of Pereyaslav. So why 200 years? Because I'm talking less about territorial control as such, but the perception of deep attachment to the land as ours. And there is a clear shift that I saw among the Russians, especially the Russian educated elites, at the beginning of the 19th century, and surprisingly it comes as a result of Napoleonic Wars. Because before Napoleonic Wars, all those grandees and aristocrats would go on their grand tour of Europe. They would go to Italy, Greece. They can't do it anymore. So they come to they go to the closest, foreign Greek-sounding land, and that's Ukraine. And you read those travelogues, and several Ukrainian historians, for instance, Olesya Khromeychuk in Kiev, they did exactly that analysis, and what we see is, it's not just the territory that is being part of the Russian Empire, is the shift in perception. It's for the first time, before that they wouldn't even get anywhere near Ukraine, even though it was part of the Russian Empire. But first they start talking about Ukraine as Russian Italy. Surprisingly, it's diverse land, southern, people look differently, behave differently, Greek names, ancient cities, especially in the Crimea. So first they start talking about Ukraine as Russian Italy, and I live now in Italy, so for me it was very interesting to read. But then it shifts from Russian Italy to, wow, that's really ours. And if we're already there in Herasones looking at all those, all those Greeks, theaters and columns and all those sites, why won't we also go to Kiev for pilgrimage? So that's this early 19th century is the mental switch among Russian elites, where they start perceiving Ukraine not just a part of that the empire controlled, but they become attached to it. They start seeing it as part of Russia as such. Because before that there were quite a few historians working in Kiev that tried to convince Russian elites that they're actually Russians and this plate is Russian, and it wasn't that successful. So that's why I start counting with the early 19th century, and also the explicit policies of Russification, which did not exist. So creating archaeological societies and cultural societies and moving the university from Vilnius to Kiev to make it a bulwark of Russification. That's when the shift is, the first half of the 19th century. I'm not talking about territorial control as such. I'm talking about psychological perceptions. And in terms of numbers, well, so there are several ways to look at it, right? We can look at voting data, we can look at public opinion data, but they won't tell us that much, because being pro-Russian or sympathetic towards Russia doesn't mean wanting to become Russian or wanting to become part of the Russian Empire. I mean, if you look at public opinion data from the early 2000s, Putin was much more popular than most Ukrainian politicians combined, at least before the Orange Revolution. That's why he went to Ukraine so many times for lobby for Yanukovych in those elections. So the numbers do not exist. I talked to quite a few local leaders in eastern Ukraine, so places like Zaporizhia, Mariupol, and the consistent narrative was that, before 2014, 60% of the people were sympathetic towards Russia, but they did not want to be Russian. They wanted a different Ukraine that would fit them without joining Russia and being friendly towards Russia. 2014, the number drops to below 10%. And we actually see it reflected in local elections and national elections as well. So the numbers, unfortunately, being pro-Russian means different things for different people, but those who really wanted to become Russians, the number is very small, even in Crimea itself, by the way. Right, so national identity can be many things, and you're right. In Ukrainian, at least in Ukrainian political identity, it consists of two things. We love Ukraine and we are not Russians, right? And it doesn't really matter who, again, it matters less your ethnicity or what. So I apologize for the language, but there are so the war spouted many wonderful memes, like, the Russian warship, etc., be brave like Ukraine. There is one that I love the most, and it comes from a song and then, some article. So again, I apologize for the language. I will say it actually. Yeah, I will say it in Ukrainian and then in English. Наша национальная идея від'їбитися від нас. Our national idea, leave us the fuck alone. And that's I think goes exactly to what you are saying. And in that sense, it's actually, so I'm very critical of Russian liberals for not constructing this different vision of identity. They had it pretty hard. It's easy to build an identity against something, and therefore, as a Ukrainian or a Pole, you can say we're not Russians, and that's how you proceed, and that's how quite a few of those identities were eventually developed and institutionalized. It's much harder for Russians to say we're not Russians and reject everything that came with that. So for those Russian liberals who did want to do something, it was much harder than for the others as well. So on the empires, well, I won't talk about the Brits because I simply don't know enough, but a wonderful historian who taught at this institution, Jeffrey Hosking, he has a wonderful phrase that, Britain had an empire, Russia was an empire. And I think it does explain something in, attachment and attitudes. It's much harder for Russians to shed their empire, be it an empire of the Soviet Union, because they're left with pretty much nothing. As a result, on Russification, so this question, absolutely, yeah. I mean, we all know that. That's why most of us speak Russian or bilingual. No questions about that. There was absolutely nothing natural about people in Bukovina or people from Lviv. And again, I grew up in Lviv. Russian is my first language. I was bilingual, but there was absolutely no logical reason for me to become a Russian speaker. For my grandparents, none of them had Russian as their first language. In fact, some of them had it as their fourth language. But the generation of my parents, yeah, we're all Russian speakers because that's what you do. And the further east you go, the more Russified you become. And it was an explicit policy of targeting over the years. I don't talk about it in the presentation, but executed Renaissance. That's targeting the teachers, switching the language of education, cracking down on everything that smacks of Ukrainian culture, be it even a Vyshyvanka on TV. That would get you in trouble. So yeah, that was an explicit policy of repression. And the Soviet state was very concerned about what they call Ukrainian bourgeois nationalism. If you look at the levels of repression and the numbers of political prisoners, no national movement, no dissident movement was repressed more heavily than the Ukrainians, with two exceptions, Crimean Tatars and the Zionists. So absolutely, yeah. And if you want a career in the state, then you speak Russian. That's how we speak Russian.
Eugene is very diplomatic about the legacy of the British Empire. I'll be perhaps slightly less diplomatic because I do live in this country. I have lived most of my life in this country. And I think one thing, I won't be stating the obvious, but maybe it's important to state the obvious sometimes. One of the legacies is that for so long, and then really until the last 3 years, London, and not just London, but London in particular, listened to Moscow a lot more than it listened to Kiev. So whose voice was perceived as credible is that of another imperial center, and certainly not that of periphery. And I think we still continue to see that legacy now. And when, at the beginning of this discussion, we started talking about, conversations happening over the head of Ukraine, it continues to be the same problem, the same legacy of imperialism, essentially, that we haven't dealt with here in the so-called Western world. But I'll shut up now.
Yeah. No.
The failure to destroy.
Okay, so let's take it in the reverse order. So the failure to destroy. Well, from the Russian perspective, clearly mistakes were made, and no, they do talk about mistakes actually, and they know very specific mistakes that they made. The key mistake from their perspective was not Russifying Galicia the way they Russified the rest of Ukraine after 1945, because what explains to a large degree the persistence is those islands that are outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg control, and that's mostly Galicia, to a bit lesser degree Bukovina, some parts that are now in Poland, Holmshina, where where they were simply not under Russian control, so there the Ukrainian language and identity was allowed to exist. And after World War II, when Galicia did become part of the Soviet Union, that was the only part of Ukraine where Ukrainian was allowed as a language of conversation, where the Russification was not as hard, where you could still hear Ukrainian on the street, and people did talk about Ukraine. People also had legacy, direct memory of fighting Russians and being deported by the Russians, and every village had their own story. So from the Russian perspective, the mistake that they didn't go far enough. That was the first mistake. And the second mistake is what Putin very concerned about is the weakness of state. Because essentially, if you look at Ukrainian independence after the 1917 revolution and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the independence is not the starting point. Independence is the result of the imperial center collapsing and becoming so dysfunctional that it's better to try independence even though you start from something else. And that's how Ukraine ended up with independence, and that's also what Russians are trying to fix, quote unquote, now. Strengthen the state and to stamp out and to crack down on even the smallest signs of Ukrainian identity in the occupied territories, because they learn from their mistakes. But those are, in my view, the reasons. So sexual violence. Well, actually don't talk that much about sexual violence, because when it comes to sexual violence, we actually know very little. It tends to be historically very underreported. The stories are skewed. I can't tell you what exactly drives sexual violence. We know that a lot is driven by alcohol, a lot is driven by impunity. We know that it's definitely not about sexual relations as such. It's a message of power and control. What exactly drives those ideas? I think it will require much more information. So I do have some anecdotes, is a bad word, but some examples of that. What exactly drives it? It's a part of the overall structure of violence, but for now, I don't think we actually know.
Can I just chip in on that, Eugene? With sexual violence, those of us who studied the Second World War will know that that's exactly how the Red Army behaved in the Second World War. It's perpetration of war crimes, including mass sexual violence, mass rapes, was a way to wage war, and not just because the commanders were turning a blind eye to it, but they were actually actively encouraging it. And we see the same patterns of behavior today.
Right, so, and Marina's question on the minorities. Right, so minorities play an absolutely crucial role, especially three minorities: the Crimean Tatars, the Poles, even though there are very few Poles in Ukraine, but they still live rent-free in the Russian imagination and occupy a huge role. But essentially the idea to Russify Ukraine starts out of the fear of the Poles and the fear that Ukrainians might be Polonized, and especially the Jews, where you see them inserted into the story in many ways that I couldn't even imagine. So I mentioned some, like the idea that Hrushevsky is somehow being paid by the Jews, and that was, by the way, people very high up in the chain of command in the Russian state making those accusations. Some very interesting parallels with the Baylis case, where the people who framed Mendel Baylis at the very same time were very actively fighting the Ukrainian national movement. Those are the same people, literally the same people behind those two. Obviously, Zelensky being Jewish is a very important part of the narrative. And the story, especially with the Jews, is similar. From the Russian perspective, it's a Russian land that needs to be Russian. And both the Ukrainians, not ethnic Ukrainians, but politically and nationally Ukrainians, and Jews simply do not fit this image of Ukraine as a Russian land. And what Russia does is try to clear or clean the land of those people, be either through pogroms, and the occupation of Galicia during World War I had a massive wave of pogroms on top of targeting of Ukrainians, through propaganda, through other things. So the stories are much more closely intertwined than most people are willing to talk about, among the Jews and among the Ukrainians on both sides. Right. So on security guarantees and what was in the last slide. So what's my view on that? My view on that is we're talking that that those things are important, but they miss the point to an extent. I would love it to be just about borders, NATO, security guarantees. That's the easy technical stuff. That's solvable. But that will get you only so far. Because my argument is that it's essentially an identity war. And unless you somehow find a way to fix the perceptions of Russia, how they view Ukraine, then NATO membership or security guarantees might prevent the military invasion. But they will not stop Russia from trying to dominate Ukraine through other means. Electoral interference, bribing politicians, that kind of stuff. They're very good at it. So those things might be necessary conditions, not just NATO membership or security guarantees. There are other ways to do it. Ukrainians talk about nuclear weapons or what they call Israel on the Dnipro, which I think would be an absolutely horrible idea for everyone. First and foremost, Ukrainians, and I'm speaking as an Israeli. Here, don't do it. So, but that's the easy part, right? That might be necessary, but not sufficient. If we really want to fix it, then Russians need to find ways to change their perceptions. If there is a ceasefire along the current lines, it's not going to happen. But I think it might happen in the long run. And in fact, we see that happening even with Russia itself. So the story of Galicia. Up until 1945, from the Russian perspective, Galicia was Russia, period. No questions asked. Now even Medvedev and people around him don't want Galicia. Why? Because of the uprising and the war and the violence. So I think, and maybe, I'm optimistic. I think some of those conversations are already happening. For instance, among Russian soldiers in Ukraine. Are those people really Russians? Are they like us? Or their families? But it can also be done top-down by changing the curriculum, changing the culture. After all, those perceptions of Ukrainians and Russians are manufactured. They're constructed, and they can be changed. And we, in the West, can do things to help Russia, help quote unquote, to do it. So I think that. So my point is that the security debate is important, but it misses the main point. The main point is identity. I don't know if it answers your question or your both questions, but that's essentially the gist of it. In terms of numbers, no, I did not count. And I honestly would not even try to count because I don't know how to define people. And the perception of what Ukrainian is also changed over time. And there are many people who we would now consider Ukrainians, but they themselves did not, right? They thought about themselves as something else. So I don't want to include them in any numbers or statistics. What else?
Language factor, which I think you partially
Right,
answered
yeah.
earlier, and genocide.
Right. So language factor, it's definitely in the Russian perspective, in the Russian perception, and there are many arguments about what drove this invasion, and what exactly the key cause. I don't know, because it requires getting into Putin's brain, and I wouldn't want to go there. It's a very dark and scary place. So, but it's definitely in the Russian perception. Again, it's not true, but that's how Russians perceive Ukraine, and that's how they talk among themselves and to themselves. Genocide studies, it's within this vein, but it's also different. I think what's happening in Ukraine is very different from the typical genocidal story because, so according to the definition of genocide, there are 4 protected groups: racial, ethnical, religious, and national. And typically, historically, the victims of genocides are targeted because of their racial, religious, or ethnic identity. Ukraine, I think, is the first case where the national group applies, where your ethnicity or your language or your race or your religion doesn't matter. The targeting is based on membership in a political national group as Ukrainians, and that's what I try to show. So it's within this broader vein. After all, that's how I'm a scholar of genocide. That's how I was trained, but it's also quite different in that way.
Fantastic, thank you. The very last, very brief question from me. You live in Italy. a country that, how shall I put it now, my turn to be diplomatic, that can benefit from learning more about this war in a nuanced way. Is your book being translated into Italian?
Unfortunately not, or at least not that I'm aware of. No, not yet. There is a Dutch translation. We are working on the German translation, and also Ukrainian translation. And I hope it will get translated to more languages, but it's not up to me.
Any translators in the room, here's your chance to pitch it. And on that note, it is available in English, obviously in the original, for sale tonight. So please, before you leave, there's a chance to buy it, and Eugene will be able to sign it for you. Please join me in thanking Eugene Finkel for his wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Thank you. Thank you.